Mecca, which is now turned into Manhattan, to the creation of mosques that look like factories in France, and everything else, and of course the destruction of so much of our dress, of our other forms of art. So it's very important for the Islamic world at the present juncture of its history to be able to distinguish between traditional Islam, fundamentalism, and modernism. Whereas there are, in fact, of course, certain areas of overlap, which I've already mentioned, for example, between modern fundamentalists and traditionalists, both of whom insist on the importance of the implementation of the Sharia, which is fundamental, of course, to Islamic life. As for the second part of your question about spirituality, I speak, of course, about that in this book. This book essentially deals with what it says, that is a situation of Islam in the modern world. But when people discuss about Islam in the modern world, very rarely do they pay attention to the spiritual and intellectual dimension. Most Western scholars are interested in riots in the street or bombs thrown or opposition, and now, of course, all the turmoil that's going on in the last few months in the Middle East. Very few pay attention to the fact that during the 19th century, during the 20th century, what's called the modern period, there were many, many great spiritual and intellectual figures in the Islamic world. All the way from the descendants of Shah Waliullah of Delhi to Sheikh al-Alawi in Algeria and everything in between. And this is usually neglected to a large extent. Now there's some reference, fortunately, here and there to some of these figures, but we need to realize that the 19th century was not simply a desert in which a few modernists appeared and tried to revive Islam by becoming pro-Western and pro-modern. There were many very authentic and powerful spiritual and intellectual currents that were still alive and produced many remarkable men. We need to study the works of people like Maulana Ali Thanwi in subcontinent of India and in Pakistan, Sheikh Farid, and there's so many in the subcontinent, in my own country, Iran. We had so many great figures, some of whom were my own teachers, Allama al-Tabayit, Muhammad Kazim Assar, people like that, the great Sufis in Egypt, in Morocco, in Algeria, intellectual figures who were not Western intellectual figures, who were not the Sayyid Ahmad Khans of the Islamic world, who have been studied enough, but who were traditional, spiritual, intellectual figures. My function in life, after many decades of writing and lecturing, is precisely to represent traditional Islamic intellectual and spiritual life that are in the contemporary mode. To be able to speak, as I do to you now, in English rather than in Persian or Arabic, and to a semi-modernized, semi-Western educated audience rather than the audience of the madrasas of Qom or Qarawiyin in Fas, about this living tradition. And I believe that the future of the Islamic world depends completely on which path the Muslim Ummah choose. And this brings me out to the last question which you posed about what I think will happen in the future. As I say in the last chapter of this book, for every authentic Muslim, the reality that the future is in the hands of God and that it's not for us to decide is very important. I'm against all futurism and this whole industry of futurology or futurism which came out in the West produced so many people. Look at the books now written in the 1880s and 1890s. Nothing has come out to be true. One little tsunami in Japan can change the whole history of Asia. And we know that fully well. So we must approach the whole question of what happens in the future in humility, with great humility, knowing that only God knows. But also God has given us intelligence, and through that, using that intelligence, we can extrapolate somewhat from the present day situation. First of all, there's no doubt that there is a strong wave of Mahdiism sweeping the Islamic world, as there is Messianism in Christianity, and the expectation of the Kalki avatar in Hinduism is a global phenomenon, and even expectation of Maitreya Buddha and Buddhism, but especially in our own religion, Islam, We're going through a period of strong Mahdiism, manifesting itself in different ways in the African world, in Iran, the subcontinent, and so forth. I do not want to go into this, but without doubt, this introduces a sense of both anxiety and fervor into the atmosphere, into the scene. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are looking at Yemen, exactly what will happen, not because it's just another country like Algeria or Tunisia, because they've read in the hadith about the events that will occur in Yemen where it appears as the Mahdi. And things like that are going on, so this is one current. Second is the current of modernism that has become weakened because of the weakening of the modern world itself, the incongruency of modernism itself, the fact that there's so many critics of modernism in the West, where modernism was first incubated. But nevertheless, much that goes on in the Islamic world is related to fruits of modernism, including rapid industrialization. And industrialization is not value-free as we think. It's related to a particular worldview. And many of the things, pop culture, that is coming from the West, and it's not true that the influence of modernism has subsided in the Islamic world, but it's not as powerful as it was during the colonial period as the only worldview to be followed. Now there are others who challenge it. Thirdly, besides these two, there's of course what is called fundamentalism of various kinds. Albeit from the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Jamaat Islamiyah of Pakistan, to the Muhammadiyya movement in Indonesia, and others, some of which I've referred to in this book. And all of these were already present in the first impact of the West upon the Islamic world in the early 19th century, when all of these waves suddenly came up. But there was one fourth one, which at that time remained silent and embraced the majority of Muslims, that is traditional Islam, that is now, in the second wave, beginning to speak. There are now many Muslim scholars in the Islamic world and those residing in the West who speak about traditional Islam not as an alim from Asar or Qom or Deoband would do, but as one who knows the West, who knows Western science, Western philosophy, Western social sciences, and who's able to present the traditional Islamic point of view in light of the challenges which these various disciplines pose. So this is a difficult, very, very difficult time for the Islamic world. I would not be honest if I did not say this. I'm not very optimistic about the immediate future, but I'm optimistic about the long-term future, because ultimately truth always wins out. Right now the Islamic world is under attack in very insidious ways from so many directions, including a new form of missionary activity, economic attack, several countries of course military attack. There's the Islamophobia which has arisen. I don't know the question of South Africa, I don't think it's like that in South Africa, but in Europe and America, which certainly did not exist 20 years ago, and one really has to carry out an intellectual jihad in the true sense, I don't mean physical jihad of war, but intellectual and spiritual jihad, to be able to answer error by truth and bitterness by sweetness, and try to emulate the khulq, the character of the Prophet ﷺ, when he entered Mecca and faced all of his former enemies. This is not an easy thing to do. It needs spiritual and moral power, strength, and it needs, of course, more than anything else, at-tawfiq min Allah, God's help, and inshallah with His help this will be done.
Professor, you know, a number of my students, in fact, young people, mostly, some of them have the historical background, they majored in history and things like that, and they often question the very idea of the Enlightenment. And both you and Akbar Ahmed have mentioned the exact same observation with regard to the cataclysmic events that occurred in Egypt in 1789. I found this absolutely fantastic. In fact, I delivered a paper once in Washington on both your ideas and Ahmed's ideas. But the questions seem to continue. And I will definitely advise and prescribe this work, of course, because it will unravel a lot of the confusion, I think, that, you know, that is taking possession of them. For example, there are three questions that normally arise, or even four, in the face of the traditional Islam is expounded by itself by Shuri, by Renee, by Martin, all these great Islam, all these great thinkers, who inshallah will have a much greater stage in the future. For example, the Enlightenment was intrinsically a revolt against anti-clericalism as well. It was a revolt against the church, right? That was
only partly. Only partly, yes.
Yeah, but
it's true, but only partly.
Yeah, but it was amazing.
Because it was, most of all,
yes,
a revolt against religion itself and the independence, the attempt to declare the independence of reason from revelation.
Correct.
That was part of it. The clerical element was part of the structure.
Yeah, the priest.
Intellectually, it was a declaration of independence of human reason.
Yeah.
And they were the human being from God.
Yes. Yes. And the questions that emerged from that are only three or so, four that I've noticed. Number one, after this revolt, they questioned the intrinsic merits of religion in the modern world, the intrinsic merits of it. And secondly, they tend to question the idea of the supernatural. Now, I will leave the idea of supernatural to you to explain to others. And then overall, the general place of religion in the modern world today, people are overwhelmed by this technology. You know? And thirdly, can religion still provide and deliver an ethical and moral basis founded upon the constitutive values of the French Revolution, which included things such as reason, tolerance, autonomy as opposed to heteronomy, which is the dominance of authorities in your lives, the conception of human rights, the application of the scientific method in particular, and that method also to both the social and political thinking, and also a rejection of superstition and priestcraft. And of course, beyond that, there seems to be a state of faith in the ability of empirical observation and rational thinking to deliver the goods into the future. So, in short, Professor, we could say that while modern scholars like Gray and others, Enlightenment scholars and supporters of the Enlightenment, they, for example, hold their confidence in the ideas of democracy, for number one. Number two, the commitment to a regime of human rights, and also to civil liberties such as freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of association, political muzamala, and all of these things, and ra'i, and then above all, the ethical autonomy of the individual. This individualism that you speak about so much, which is really fascinating and fired my imagination. Many years ago, not now, say, many years ago, and then of course the general scientific outlook. So there are three things that emerge out of these things. And I won't be long on this, Professor, but I think it's important for our audience to understand it, because you deal with such profundity with this in your work. I was mesmerized to an extent to the way in which you unpack the concepts. All the time you're unpacking and unpacking. And therefore I think you need to write another volume to keep on unpacking for us, inshallah. It's wonderful reading your works, Professor. The three things that emerge, three essential features of the modern conditions that imparts pride to modernists are the following three. A commitment to democracy, number one, a full commitment, which they don't believe that the Muslim world could ever have delivered in that sense. And number two, the importance of the impartiality of law. We're speaking about Sharia on this side, and they're speaking about civil law, and the law in England is different from the law in South Africa, in parts here and there, and stuff like that. They don't have case law, our constitutions are different. Yet they fall within that broad ambit of the democratic thinking and decision making, a kind of shuratic process. And then thirdly, the civil liberties that have been won after the the center of gravity, of course, of the French Revolution was in the mid to late 18th century. Now the freedoms won from that in terms of the civil liberties, such as freedom of belief, freedom of expression, the question of privacy, the freedom of choosing life partners, for example, and above all, the autonomy of the religion. Let me just quote, I read somewhere a quote from Immanuel Kant. The fact that I would, if I can locate it very quickly. Here it is, commenting on the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant says, and you are very familiar with Kant, I'm not the expert, you are the expert in these things. He says, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. And I put that into italics, without guidance from another. Whereas in traditional Islam, we know of the silsila, the ijazah system, the attachment to a master who has fully comprehended and not only comprehended, but also fully realized within his personality the verities, the beauties of Islam, the spiritual depth of Islam. How do we as lecturers today answer these or approach these particular questions in the light of traditional Islam?
Well, you've said so many different things, it's really difficult for me to answer them all, and my time is almost up, but let me very briefly say that Friedrich Schumann once said of Kant, that's the most intelligent way of being an intelligent. Kant. That is, the critique of reason is by reason itself.
Yes.
Human reason is not sufficient unto itself to be the ultimate criterion of knowledge and truth. Even in everyday discourse, everyday life, our reason is based upon the data of our senses.
Yes.
The reason why it's in the middle of the air cannot function in mathematics, which is the purest of sciences in a sense. You always start with the premise. The reason is that then the mathematical reasoning bases itself upon those principles which are the premise for that mathematical reasoning. There's something seriously philosophically wrong with the Enlightenment. That's why it was also later on in the 19th and 20th century such criticism of it. And later even European philosophy, obviously.
And the romantic
romantic movement, and then of course the movement of the 20th century with phenomenology and going completely in another direction. Anyway, I will not get into that. But let me first of all, because our Muslim audience here, say that the word, a mixed audience anyway, there's not anyway, African audience. That's right, that's just anyway, not American or European audience who probably have heard about this. But we keep hearing in non-Western cultures about the age of enlightenment.